The wind was quieter in the new world, not because the air was still, but because there were fewer voices to fill it. Cities once teeming with life now echoed with the shuffle of sparse footsteps and the low murmur of survivors who had forgotten how to be a society. Across oceans and continents, the world reeled in its silence, staggered by the weight of its own sudden emptiness. Half of life had vanished in a moment, and in the days and weeks that followed, humanity did not scream, it whispered. In the broken remains of the Avengers compound, the dust had long settled on shattered consoles and bent girders. The screens that once displayed threats across the globe now flickered with static, or flashed red with system errors. There were no battles now, no alien armadas, no world-ending beams of light, no suits clashing in the sky. Only the remnants of Earth's mightiest heroes remained, scattered like fragments of a dream that had once felt unshakable. Steve Rogers had stayed. Others had drifted away, some to grief, some to find family, some to try and rebuild, but Steve had remained among the ruins, as though tethered to a promise made to a world that no longer existed. He ran daily laps through the cracked remains of upstate New York, not for training, but for memory. Each step was a beat in a silent march, each breath a resistance against despair. His shield hung in the compound's war room, untouched, not because he had given up, but because he no longer knew who to fight for. Elsewhere, in Tokyo's neon-lit alleyways, Clint Barton walked like a ghost. He had buried his family in his heart and taken on the mask of retribution. But the rage had quieted, the blood had dried on his hands, and now he stood among the remains of his final victims, their weapons clattering to the ground. He stared at his reflection in a broken mirror and saw not a hero or an assassin, just a man with no one left to be angry for. He tossed the sword aside and vanished into the night, seeking meaning in a world where balance had come not as salvation, but as sentence. Tony Stark had not survived the snap, not because of Thanos' will, but because the absence of Pepper had vanished. With a soft gasp, her eyes locked on his as her body disintegrated into light had hollowed him. He worked for a time in the ruins of his Manhattan tower, building and rebuilding suits for no one, writing algorithms that searched endlessly for signals that would never come. Friday monitored him until one day he simply didn't get out of bed. He had instructed her not to call anyone. When Rhodey found him weeks later, there was only silence and a final note encrypted with his biometric signature. It read only, "I hope he was right. I hope it mattered." Natasha Romanoff had taken to the field again, not for S.H.I.E.L.D., which no longer existed in any real form, but for the unspoken promise to the billions who remained. She coordinated food convoys, stopped warlords, dismantled growing cults who worshipped the Mad Titan. Her missions were quiet and thankless, and she never stayed in one place for long. She slept in hangars, ate in refugee kitchens, fought like a phantom, and vanished before her name could be spoken. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see herself, just echoes of Budapest and red in her ledger, growing again for reasons she could no longer name. Thor, once a god among men, had retreated to the high cliffs of Norway, where the sea met sky in a curtain of mist and memory. He had watched Asgard burn, watched his people perish, and when he raised Stormbreaker to strike Thanos, he had missed the head. And then the snap came. Half of New Asgard gone, half of the stars dimmed. He sat in silence now, meat forgotten, in its flask, listening to the ocean tell stories he didn't remember learning. Valkyrie tried to reach him, tried to raise him, but the thunder was quiet now. The storms had grown still. Bruce Banner, changed by his time as the other guy, wandered the world trying to heal what had been broken. He merged intellect and strength and became something new, something stable. But he could not rebuild what had been undone. He met with scientists, taught children, built solar farms in the ruins of African villages. He smiled, often, but it never reached his eyes. At night, he recorded messages for Tony that would never be heard, and read quantum models that showed one truth again and again. It had been inevitable. Thanos, now resting on a garden world, far from the embers of his conquest, walked slowly among the sprouting vines and towering trees. The sunrise painted his armor, hung like a scarecrow in the fields, with hues of fire and hope. He had no followers, no armies, no speeches, just the rustle of growing things, and the wind in the tall grass. His gauntlet, ruined and fused to his arm, hung like a scar. He never used it again. He needed no further acts. The universe, he believed, was balanced, and in the balance, peace would grow. But the peace was not quiet. It groaned and cracked under the strain of trauma. The world had stopped screaming. Yes, but not because it had healed. Because it was afraid to speak. The new governments that formed in the wake of the decimation were cautious, fragmented. Nations turned inward. Cities became fortresses. The world economy had collapsed and reassembled into barter. Local currencies, solar energy. New coalitions formed, calling themselves the heirs, the seeds, the horizon front, each with a vision of what the world should become. All united in one truth. The age of heroes was over. But not all had given up. In Wakanda, Shuri survived, and with a brilliance, rebuilt what she could. She led her people, not as a princess, but as a guide through the dark. Her brother gone, her king dust, she turned Wakanda into a beacon of science and healing. Refugees came in ships and on foot, and she took them all. She developed fusion cores, restructured crop growth, cured diseases that had returned to Earth in the wake of societal collapse. She worked silently, always wearing black, her hair short, her gaze unflinching. Sometimes, she thought of T'Challa's smile and imagined he would be proud, in deep space. Carol Danvers had become a myth. Some said she battled celestial tyrants. Others that she negotiated peace between species long at war. But the truth was simpler. She ran from grief. She flew from planet to planet, looking for places that needed help, that whispered of balance, not as punishment but as potential. She saw the effects of the snap across galaxies, and in every starless night, she heard Maria's laughter. She fought to fill the silence, to matter in a universe that had decided for her what was necessary. Years passed. The Earth did not collapse. But it did not rise, either. It hung in a suspended state, slowly crawling toward stability. Children born after the snap grew up with half-class rooms, empty birthday parties, and a strange reverence for a figure they never knew. To them, Thanos was not a villain. He was the change, the before and after. Museums showed his face alongside ancient gods. Some worshipped, others cursed, all remembered. Then came the day, the stars flickered, not because of a threat, but because of a birth. Somewhere beyond Saturn, a pocket of unmeasured cosmic energy erupted, and from it emerged a being neither man nor god, a child of the snap, the first living creature born directly from the energies released in that moment. She had no parents, no species, but she burned with understanding, spoke in quantum harmonics, and aged in weeks. She called herself Era, and she remembered everything. Every name lost, every cry unheard, every strand of DNA unraveled. She was the balance incarnate. The future made flesh. When Era came to Earth, she did not demand allegiance. She came barefoot, glowing, and knelt in the ruins of Sokovia. Steve Rogers, older now, beard white, stood before her and felt something he had not known in years. Hope. She spoke of reconfiguration, of quantum rebirth, of timelines merging, not by stones but by will. She offered not vengeance but transcendence. And the people listened. For the first time since the snap, they listened. Some still resisted. Governments feared her. Militaries tested her. But she never raised a hand. Instead, she touched minds, healed sickness, brought visions of possible futures. She visited Bruce and told him of a green world yet to be. She touched Natasha's shoulder and showed her a red room empty of blood. She sat beside Thor on the cliffs and whispered of a sister he would one day raise from starlight. And she visited the garden, where Thanos waited. They spoke for days. When it ended, Thanos did not rise. He sat beneath the tree and closed his eyes, smiling. The vine grew around his gauntlet and cracked the stone. When he died, it was not as a conqueror, but as a farmer, watching the first sprouts of spring. Era became the axis. Not a ruler, not a god, but a bridge. And through her, the world changed. Not quickly, not perfectly, but with purpose. The Avengers, what remained of them, gathered once more not to fight, but to bear witness to a world reborn not in glory, but in understanding. And somewhere, in the silence of the stars, the balance held. The rebirth of Earth was not immediate. Change, even when touched by something as profound as Era, moved slowly, like rivers carving new valleys over centuries. But it began. Across broken highways and silent fields, people emerged from their emotional tombs, blinking into sunlight they no longer feared. Where once there had been ash, there were now seedlings. Where once memorials lined every avenue, murals of possibility bloomed instead. Era never claimed to rule, but her presence catalyzed something raw and ancient in humanity, the need to connect, to build, to forgive. Steve Rogers took up his shield again, not for battle, but as a symbol of what could be reclaimed. He began visiting communities not as Captain America, but as Steve, the man who remembered a world before the skies cracked. He helped build houses with his bare hands, taught children how to grow their own food, mediated arguments over land and water, and futures, and in the quiet moments, when the stars were sharp above and his joints ached with age, he would sit alone and whisper the names of those he had lost. Not in mourning, but in gratitude. Clint Barton returned to his farmhouse. It was empty and overgrown, but he rebuilt it, plank by plank. He no longer carried weapons, only seeds. Neighbors came, then strangers. Soon the Barton land was a commune, not bound by doctrine or fear, but by shared labor and shared meals. Sometimes he would climb the roof with a mug of coffee and look out across the rows of vegetables, the kids playing near the creek, and think, this is what she would have wanted. He kept a single photo on his wall: Laura, Lila, Cooper, Nathaniel, smiling whole. He never spoke of the Ronin again. In Wakanda, Shuri continued her work, now joined by scientists and thinkers from every corner of the planet. The new Wakanda initiative trained engineers instead of soldiers, diplomats instead of spies. They sent envoys to forgotten places, to towns that had crumbled and been left behind. Vibranium technology helped irrigate deserts and filter poisoned rivers. Drones seeded forests from the air. Cities began to glow, again not with excess, but with purpose. Shuri walked among them as a leader, cloaked not in royal robes but in lab coats, her hands always stained with ink and dust. Her brother's necklace hung in a glass case beside the first quantum node she had ever built. Both equally sacred. Natasha found peace in the motion. She never stopped traveling, but her steps were lighter now. No longer hunting, she moved to teach. She founded shelters that trained self-defense and meditation. Places where people who had lost everything could learn to fight, not others, but their own pain. She taught orphans to disappear and reappear when they chose, not when the world decided. She was spotted in Marrakesh, in Belfast, in the mountains of Tibet. Each time, she left behind a journal, written by hand, filled with her memories and her mistakes. They were copied and passed from hand to hand, not as gospel, but as warning and hope. Thor, finally stirred from his stupor by Era's words, returned to New Asgard. The people greeted him not with celebration, but with solemn joy. He had aged. In his exile, the godly glow dimmed, the lines on his face more human than divine. But when he spoke now, it was not with thunder, it was with humility. He appointed Valkyrie as ruler and stepped aside. Together they turned New Asgard into a refuge for those who had lost planets, homes, families. They welcomed Kree and Skrull, Rigelians and Sen. The cliffs echoed with laughter once more, and in the sky, two goats pulled a boat through aurora storms as children pointed upward and cheered. Thor became a storyteller, spinning tales of gods and monsters around fire pits, always ending with, this, the real power was not in the lightning, but in learning when to put it down. Bruce Banner joined Shuri in Wakanda for a time. Together they mapped the lingering radiation of the snap, created new neural interfaces for amputees, rewrote textbooks on quantum mechanics. His form, the professor as some called him, began to shift again, not with rage, but with evolution. As the world healed, so did he. He found equilibrium, and with it, joy. On his birthday, he laughed so hard he turned entirely green for the first time in years. He taught at universities, danced at festivals, built sculptures with his massive hands out of repurposed metals. People asked him how he controlled it now. He always smiled and said, I stopped fighting it. It stopped fighting back. Carol Danvers finally returned to Earth, not in flame and glory, but in a quiet descent over the Atlantic. She met with Era in silence, their words unspoken, exchanged in light and memory. Carol had seen galaxies fail and be reborn, had felt the edges of power and loneliness curl around her like dark matter. Now, for the first time, she stayed. She helped reform SWORD, not as a watchdog but as a bridge between Earth and its galactic neighbors. She trained pilots, translated alien languages, taught children to read the stars as maps, not threats. On weekends, she visited Monica's grave and told her what she had seen. Her voice always cracked at the end, and Era, ever at the center of it all, never claimed dominion. She became a part of the earth like water, like wind, appearing in moments of great sorrow and great hope. She healed a dying whale off the coast of Patagonia with a touch. She sat beside a child with terminal illness and turned the pain into memory, so that she could say goodbye smiling. She was in every continent at once, and yet never where you expected. People told stories of her like myths. She lit a wildfire to stop a war. She sang a volcano quiet. She turned back time once just to give a man one last hug from his son. No one saw her die because she never would. She was the consequence of consequence, the child of inevitability, and so she remained. The world was not perfect. Greed did not vanish. Some still built walls. Some still hoarded. But now, there was balance. When people fell, others helped them rise. When darkness returned, light followed. Era taught that pain could not be eliminated, only shared. That healing did not mean forgetting. That love meant remembering even the hurt. Years became decades. Statues fell and were not replaced. New art filled galleries. New music filled streets. And new languages emerged from blended cultures. The world no longer identified itself by what it had lost, but by what it had chosen to become. Steve Rogers died quietly, surrounded by the people he had once saved. He was buried beneath a tree planted from the soil of every continent. His shield was passed not to a soldier, but to a teacher. Clint passed in his sleep, his children and grandchildren singing songs he'd taught them. Natasha died on a high mountain, saving a caravan from an avalanche, her face turned to the sky in peace. Thor vanished one day, leaving behind a hammer embedded in stone, waiting not for a worthy successor, but for someone who understood what it meant to walk away. Bruce became a legend in the annals of science. His final paper, titled simply Becoming, Carol returned to the stars when she knew Earth could walk without her. An era, always era, sat beneath the tree on which Steve was buried, watching as a new child was born beneath a moon she had once cradled with her thoughts. And far beyond, in the deep dark, where even light forgets itself, there was no war, no blinding flash of power, only stillness. For the universe, once torn by ambition and fear, had learned to breathe again, not because it had been saved, but because, at last, it had been understood. There came a time when the snap was no longer the central marker in the stories people told. The world had found new ways to define itself. Children born after the balance, as it was now called, did not flinch at empty streets or silent corners. They grew up beneath skies cleared of smog and noise, learned in classrooms rebuilt with their hands, and carried within them a sense of purpose unshaped by vanity or conquest. They read about Iron Man and the Mad Titan in books, watched old footage with reverence and confusion, and asked questions that their teachers could no longer answer. What was it like to lose half the world? How did it feel when people turned to dust? Was it worth it? In these questions, a new generation began to form its identity. They did not worship the past, but neither did they forget it. The stories of those who came before were etched into the stones of new cities and whispered in the quiet rituals of daily life. On the day known as Remembrance, people left food for the absent at their tables, lit candles beside old photographs, and wrote messages into the wind, not out of grief, but gratitude and acknowledgement of cost, of sacrifice, and of the weight of survival. Among the hills of northern Wakanda, a child named Amani was born with the ability to dream in echoes. Her dreams were not visions of the future, nor memories of the past, but something else, reverberations of potential. She would wake in the night with tears on her face, having seen cities that never were, skies filled with ships that never flew, families that never fell apart. Her mother, a healer, took her to Shuri, who by now had become a matriarch not just of Wakanda but of global science. Shuri listened, asked questions, and then did something no one expected. She gave Amani a place at her table, not as a student, but as an advisor. From that moment, Amani's visions began to shape the future. Cities grew upward instead of outward. Power grids followed the patterns of constellations she described. New forms of art emerged that could only be experienced with closed eyes and still hearts. When Amani turned 16, she stood on the floor of the United Coalition of Earth and spoke a single sentence. The stars are asking us to listen again. And so humanity, for the first time in a long time, looked up not in fear or desire, but in wonder, in space. Once a field of battle and conquest, the silence became symphonic. The remnants of Sword were formed under Carol Danvers' legacy, now named themselves the Harmonics. Their ships did not patrol, they explored. They did not guard, they learned. The Harmonics opened channels with species once considered hostile, sharing music, water, seeds. Treaties were not inked in politics, but etched in holographic light across asteroid fields where no flags could wave. Humanity's voice joined a galactic chorus, not in dominance, but in harmony. Meanwhile, On the earth that had survived itself, a quiet revolution spread through the arts. Painters stopped using brushes. They painted with wind, with magnetism, with algae that changed color in response to emotion. Sculptors carved from clouds with sound. Musicians composed symphonies on instruments grown in the soil, each tree and vine vibrating with memory. Dancers performed on moving platforms shaped like petals drifting down rivers. Their movements synced to the pulses of the earth. These were not distractions from grief, but extensions of it, testimonies of endurance. Fragments of mourning transformed into beauty. Among the first artists of this age was a man named Eli Stark, son of Tony and Pepper. Raised in silence, in safety, far from the legacy of armor and sacrifice, Eli found his gift not in technology, but in storytelling. At age 12, he began writing stories that made readers weep, tales of gods and monsters who learned to garden, of titans who held the sky not with might, but with apology. He refused to use the name Stark in his publications, signing only with a symbol, a small arc reactor drawn in charcoal. But everyone knew who he was, and when he turned 21, he stood before the United Coalition and read the final words of his father's last journal, long sealed away until that moment. They were not about war, nor invention, but about love. I hope the world finds a way to become small again, small enough to matter. In New Asgard, the hammer once embedded in stone had begun to hum, not with the promise of battle, but with song. Children heard it when they passed by, a low and pulsing rhythm like a heartbeat beneath the earth. One day, a girl named Ingrid touched the handle, not out of ambition, but because it made her feel less alone. The stone crumbled around it, like ash. She lifted the hammer, and thunder rolled across the scene, not loud, but joyful. Valkyrie named her keeper, not of war, but of stories. She would fly through the world not as a weapon, but as a witness. The storms she summoned nourished crops and extinguished wildfires. Her laughter echoed through the fjords. When she dreamed, she saw a one-eyed man in golden armor smiling down at her, saying, "It's time." Elsewhere, in the deepest part of the Atlantic, an old enemy stirred, but not as before. Namor, king of Talakon, had watched the surface world suffer and change. He had grieved in silence for the losses among his people. But when the balance began to hold, when his spies brought him tales of healing and humility, he emerged not with tridents and rage, but with questions. He met with Shuri once more. They walked along the shores of both their kingdoms. He placed a coral crown upon her head and said, not as ruler, but as sister. And together, they began a partnership, rooted in the water, that touched every shore. Era remained, though she no longer appeared as she once had. Some claimed she had dissolved into the biosphere, her energy becoming part of the wind and soil. Others believed she walked among them still, changing faces, always listening, but every so often, when decisions grew heavy or sorrow returned like an old ache, someone would hear a song carried by no wind, a lullaby that ended with a single word, still. Then, one evening, long after the world had ceased counting years, by the old calendars, a ripple passed through the stars. Not a threat, not an invasion, but an invitation. A vast intelligence from another galaxy sent a message in pure color, visible only during moments of quiet, to the hearts of those prepared to understand. They asked a single question: are you ready to share your story? The world gathered, old heroes, young dreamers, farmers and scientists and artists. They built a vessel not of metal, but of memory, guided by emotion rather than engines. They called it Arkera, meaning listening place in a dozen new tongues. As it rose into orbit, lights across the planet blinked in unison. A global heartbeat bidding farewell. Eli Stark was aboard, carrying stories bound in leather and fiber. Amani served as their navigator, her dreams guiding them between currents of dark matter. Ingrid brought the hammer, now split into 7 pieces, each resonating with a different element of life. The harmonics provided maps, made of sound, and Wakanda gifted engines that ran on sunlight and song. As Arkera disappeared into the distance, no one wept. Instead, they celebrated. The world had not only survived the snap, it had learned from it, had built from it, had become something greater, not despite the loss, but through it. Balance had not meant stagnation. It had meant the chance to begin again. And far from Earth, beneath the roots of stars and the gravity wells of dead suns, Thanos slept. Not buried, but rooted, his remains dissolved into the soil of his garden world, where nothing died anymore. Vines grew in the shape of his armor. Flowers bloomed where his blood had once watered the ground. A single tree rose from where he had rested, gnarled and tall, its fruit bitter and bright. Beneath it, carved in stone by no known hand, were words in an old dialect of Titan. In balance, we learned to listen, and the universe, vast and strange, listened back. The journey of the Arcara stretched farther than any vessel constructed by human hands had ever dared. Beyond the pull of their own sun, past the edge of the heliosphere, it entered a corridor of silence where no probe or signal had ever endured, yet the ship did not falter. It was not powered by fuel, nor by gravity, but by resonance, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. It moved because those within believed it should, and within its chambers, stories pulsed like blood through veins. Of crystal and memory. Eli Stark chronicled each new world they visited. The first was a sphere of liquid sapphire, with cities suspended like bubbles on its surface. The beings there had no names, no voices, only pulses of light and shadow exchanged. Like dances, they communicated in rhythm and silence, and when Eli finally understood their greeting, he wept. It was not a welcome, but an acknowledgement. You are not the first to hurt, and you will not be the last to heal. He recorded their story in a book, bound with recycled bark and meteoric dust, and titled it The Blue That Sang. Amani found herself changed with each light year. Her dreams became deeper, more layered, as if the very cosmos was speaking to her in ancient, buried tongues. On one moon, she lay still for 3 days, her mind adrift in visions of civilizations that rose and fell before Earth had cooled. She saw great fungal networks that ruled planets like neural crowns, and crystalline beings that grew by forgetting. When she awoke, she etched a spiral into the floor of the Arcora's core chamber and said, "This is the shape of how things learn." Ingrid, the keeper of the hammer, rarely used her gift. She understood now, the power meant patience. On a silent red planet, with a cracked crust and whispering winds, they encountered a massive coiled creature made of bone and thought. It lashed out in confusion, seeing the travelers as echoes of a war long buried. As it rose above them, casting miles of shadow, Ingrid stepped forward, split her hammer into its 7 forms, and knelt. The creature paused. The pieces of the hammer hummed in perfect harmony, and the monster, ancient and tired, lowered itself to the sand and closed its eyes. Ingrid collected the pieces again, not in triumph, but in understanding. As months passed, the time aboard Arcara was measured more in moments than minutes. The ship grew larger, not in physical size, but in memory. Every world visited added rooms, libraries, gardens, sanctuaries. One chamber became a forest filled with the scent of Thanos' garden world, though none aboard had ever visited it. Another, a holographic sea, filled with voices of the vanished, not in mourning, but in chorus. They sang songs remembered only by grandmothers and wind. The crew expanded as well. They welcomed a diplomat from the singing kin of Del Rosa, who spoke only through mirrored reflections. A stone-skinned empath named Gorin joined them after watching Eli speak to a mountain and make it weep. The harmonics sent more explorers, and eventually a child born aboard named Nova, for she was the spark of the voyage's fusion. She was raised by all, carried in the arms of Amani, sung to sleep by Ingrid's humming hammer. Her first word was not a name, but a question. Why? One day, they reached the source of the message. It was not a planet, nor a station, but a ring miles in diameter, floating in the dark like a forgotten crown. Within it pulsed a consciousness, not bound to a body, but to rhythm. They called themselves Oath, not a species, not a being, but a convergence. They had lived for eons, gathering the music of civilizations, the echoes of loss and resurrection. When they spoke to Artura, it was not with sound, but with memory. Oath asked them to share Earth's song. Eli read his stories, each line illuminating the ring with shifting color. Amani laid her dreams bare, letting Oath swim through her mind, like fish in deep water. Ingrid placed her hammer's pieces in a circle and struck them in a pattern that only Era had ever heard. The ring wept, not in sadness, but in recognition. Oth replied by giving them a gift, not knowledge, but invitation. A map of cosmic frequencies, stories unfinished across the stars. Not all would be peaceful. Some would be dark, others strange. But all would be listening. And the Arcara, now officially named a vessel of witness, was granted passage into the flow beyond the current between galaxies, known only in theoretical physics and the dreams of dying prophets. Before they left, they sent one last signal to Earth. It came as a dream shared by millions on the same night, a vast garden lit by unfamiliar constellations. A child running barefoot toward a rising sun, and a single word whispered in every language. Onward. Back. On Earth. That message stirred old and new hearts alike. In Wakanda, Shuri, now gray-haired and regal, felt a breeze pass through her lab, though no windows were open. She smiled, pressed her palm against a globe of light, and said, "They made it." In New Asgard, the cliffs rang with laughter as new gods played with old stories, blending myth and meaning. On the farms of Kansas, an old woman named MJ Watson led a class of engineers who rebuilt things not because they were broken, but because they wanted to learn how they worked. In orbit, the Harmonics launched a sister vessel, named the Echo, to follow in Akira's trail. One day, in a corner of the Pacific, a lone fishing boat stumbled across an island that had not been there before. On it stood a garden. No guards, no gates, just a tree with purple leaves and fruit that shimmered in and out of view. And beneath it, a single bench, empty, waiting. Ira was never seen again. But her name was spoken like a seed passed between cupped hands. Parents told their children she lived in the breath between lightning and thunder. In the silence, just before someone forgave themselves. Temples bore her image not as deity, but as a reminder. She had not fixed the world. She had made it possible to be fixed. Decades passed. The children of those who had known the Avengers grew up in a world that did not need them. Not because heroes were gone, but because they had become unnecessary. Communities defended themselves, with kindness, not weapons. Disputes were settled in memory circles, where both sides were forced to speak the pain behind their anger. The word war became something studied, not practiced. There were still losses, still floods and quakes and fires, but now, each tragedy was met with hands already reaching out. Eli's stories became part of global curriculum. Amani's spirals guided the architecture of new cities. Ingrid's hammer was divided and placed in the 7 corners of the planet, humming low songs to keep balance. Nova, grown tall and radiant, took command of the Arkora when Eli passed beneath the soft stars of an unnamed moon. His final words were written on a page of stardust. "Tell them we listened, and somewhere in the dark, at the edge of a galaxy so far that its light had never reached Earth, a voice whispered across the void. Not a god, not a monster, just a voice. It said. The choice was hard. The cost was everything. But it was right, and the stars, old as grief and young as possibility, flickered in reply. The Arkera, now under Nova's guidance, moved through the flow beyond, as though it were a current of thought rather than space. The laws of physics bent around its hull like reeds in a stream. Time distorted, not in chaotic pulses, but in measured waves, allowing moments of reflection to stretch and deepen. The travelers aboard no longer marked their days by revolutions of planets, but by stories gathered and shared. They called these storyings sacred sessions where experience was not told but lived, re-experienced through light, sound, and sensation, transmitted through the vessel's memory systems. Nova had inherited not only the Arkera, but the purpose that came with it. Raised among those who had once been Avengers in name or legacy, she carried a paradox in her heart, the weight of history and the promise of renewal. Her skin shimmered faintly under certain lights, a gift of the flow beyond. Some whispered she was becoming like Ironot, a being of flesh alone, but of pattern and potential. She denied it gently, saying only that she was listening. Their next encounter came in the orbit of a planet shaped like a spiral shell. The inhabitants were not humanoid in any conventional sense. They were beings of lattice and frequency, existing in forms that seemed woven from aurora. They called themselves the Ravel, and their entire civilization was devoted to the concept of entanglement, motional, historical, quantum. They believed that all consciousness was a single, fragmented mirror trying to remember its own face. To visit the Ravel was to be seen not just externally, but entirely. During their time there, each crew member was asked to participate in a reflection. It was not optional. The Ravel would not communicate further until the process was honored. The reflection was a ceremony where the Ravel mirrored the visitor's past, not as it happened, but as it was felt. Ingrid saw her childhood loneliness on the cliffs of New Asgard, transformed into a storm desperately trying to find a place to land. Amani's earliest vision of a collapsing Earth took the form of a glass tower falling in slow motion, each pane screaming her name. Nova, for the first time, witnessed her own birth from outside her body, a convergence of need and love in a universe not yet ready to understand her. The experience left them shaken but clarified. The Ravel then shared their own story. A war, fought not with weapons, but with memory. Two factions who had tried to forget each other into extinction. Only when the last word was almost erased did they realize the truth. Forgetting was not erasure. It was a kind of dying. They rebuilt their society around preservation, not of facts, but of feeling. They asked the Archera to carry their story forward, to anchor it in a world where others could feel its weight. Eli's final book was translated into their resonance, and in return, they gave Nova a map, a living song that shifted according to the vessel's emotional state, always guiding, always adjusting. Years, or what passed for years, moved through the Archera like wind through sails. New crew members joined. Some left, their journeys complete. The vessel expanded again, this time into what they called the Remembering Garden, a forest grown from the collective grief of its passengers. Each tree held a memory, not carved or written but sung into the bark. The garden had no paths. It was meant to be wandered. Those who entered came out changed, not because they found answers, but because they learned which questions to stop asking. On one world, they encountered silence so profound it shattered the vocal cords of a diplomat who tried to speak without permission. This was the realm of the shrouded A-race, who communicated through stillness and shadow. They taught Nova how to listen with her spine, how to feel intention in the pause between breaths. The shrouded had no history, no names. They had chosen anonymity after witnessing what they called the long grief a celestial collapse caused by one civilization's refusal to accept loss. From them, the Archera learned restraint, that not every story was theirs to tell, that witnessing did not mean possessing. Back on Earth, the ripple of the Archera's journey still echoed. Cities grew in fractal patterns, based on Amani's spirals, responding dynamically to the emotions of their inhabitants. Schools taught emotional fluency as the core curriculum. The Council of Earth no longer sat in halls of marble, but in open air, sanctuaries filled with wind and sound, where decisions were made only after days of shared silence. Time was not lost. It was repurposed. Children grew up playing games inspired by the legends of the original Avengers, but with new endings. In their games, villains repented. Heroes made mistakes. Battles ended with conversations. They played not to win, but to understand. Some still wore Captain America's colors, or carried toy hammers. But they did so knowing the symbols were not shields or weapons, they were questions. Who do I protect? What is worth lifting? One of those children, a girl named Luma, dreamed often of a garden in the stars. When she turned 15, she joined the Echo, Earth's second vessel, and set out to find it. Before leaving, she placed a single flower on the bench beneath the purple tree in the Pacific, whispering, "I'll bring them your story." She did not know who she was speaking to, but the wind answered anyway. The Archera's next great trial came, not from without, but from within. As the vessel approached a void known as the Scar of Light, a region where stars had once flourished and now hung like ghosts, strange phenomena began to plague the crew. Memories reversed. Emotions surged in unnatural patterns. Nova lost track of her own thoughts. For a time, it seemed the ship would tear itself apart. It was Amani who realized the truth. The Scar of Light was not a region, but a wound and echo of a decision made long ago, a consequence of the snap itself, reverberating still across time and space. The act of having the universe had created a fracture in narrative continuity, a place where stories unraveled. To pass through, they could not carry their memories in the usual way. They had to anchor themselves, not in who they were, but in why they were. Each crew member wrote a single sentence and placed it in the core of the Archera. These were not biographies, they were intentions. Amanis read, "To make dreams into doors." Ingrid said, "To hold without breaking." Nova wrote, "To listen forward." With these declarations, the ship adjusted its frequency, becoming not a vessel of memory, but of promise. They passed through the scar without losing themselves. On the other side, they found a galaxy being born, twin suns, encircled by clouds of glowing potential. It was raw, unshaped, waiting. Nova turned to the crew and said, "We are no longer witnesses. We are stewards." And so, they began to help. Not by building, but by guiding. Teaching the stars how to listen before they learned to burn. Planting stories like seeds. Singing balance into existence. Back on Earth, the sky changed. New constellations appeared. The oceans began to pulse in rhythm with deep stellar tides. People looked upward, not in fear or wonder, but in kinship. They knew now that they were not alone, that someone was listening, that the stories they lived mattered, even if only as echoes. And somewhere, farther than far, deeper than deep, a remnant of Thanos drifted, a particle of thought, a flicker of will. It watched, unjudging. It had no hand left to raise, no voice to command. But if it could have spoken, it might have said only this: Balance is not stillness. It is motion held in trust. And the stars, always learning, whispered in return, "We remember." The Arcora lingered in the newborn galaxy for what felt like lifetimes. Its crew, now seasoned by years of impossible travels and sacred encounters, no longer thought in terms of destinations. They moved in rhythms, cycles of listening, sharing, adapting. The twin suns of the young system flickered like eyes blinking open, and around them, matter spun in slow spirals of potential. It was the infancy of something colossal and unformed, and the Arcora sang lullabies into its growing bones. Dreams changed again. They were no longer echoes of pain or glimpses of what might have been. Instead, she began to see what never had been before: concepts without precedent, colors that had no analog on Earth or in memory, stories that came into existence only because she dreamed them. She would wake with tears in her eyes and scribble new spirals onto the Arcora's interior walls, patterns that shimmered, changed temperature, whispered truths in forgotten tongues. Some began to believe she was dreaming the galaxy itself into coherence, her subconscious acting as midwife to the cosmos. Nova watched her with equal parts awe and love. The vessel had changed her too, not merely in appearance, her skin now subtly iridescent, her eyes reflecting not what they saw but what they sensed. But in presence, she no longer moved like a child of Earth, but like a being of momentum, purpose embodied. She had not become Era, as some whispered, but something else. The next iteration, where Era had come from consequence, Nova emerged from continuity. She was the thread that wove intention through the chaos of emergence. Ingrid, the keeper, had grown quiet. Her hammer no longer sang unless called to. She had learned to wield stillness as deftly as thunder, and with each passing orbit, she let more of her power go. Not in loss, but in offering. The 7 shards of her weapon were planted one by one into the swirling clouds of the forming planets, each embedded deep in protomatter, vibrating with the memory of restraint. The final piece, the heart shard, she placed into the smallest moon of the innermost world, whispering to it a single word: enough. That moon pulsed, faintly, and began to spin. The people of the Arcera no longer feared death, not because they had transcended it, but because they had woven themselves into a lineage of remembrance so deep, so wide, that nothing was truly lost. When a crew member passed, their memory was not buried, it was planted. The remembering garden expanded, adding bioluminescent trails of spores that sang lullabies in response to visitors' breath. Even strangers who came aboard could walk through it and find their own sorrows reflected, soothed, and transformed. Then came a moment unlike any other. The Arcora received a signal. It was not from a planet or a civilization, not from a starship or probe. It came from the vacuum itself, a pulse without origin, a pattern that could not be triangulated. It was not data, but tone, and not a tone that any known instrument could generate. It made the ship itself vibrate in sympathetic resonance, made dreams deepen, made language feel inadequate. Amani named it the Origin Pulse. Nova, after hours of silence, ordered the Arcora to follow it. There was no destination. The vessel followed the tone through uncharted space, past anomalies that bent time like paper, through corridors where dark matter glittered like dust. As they traveled, the crew felt themselves change again. Memories blurred into dreams. Identities became fluid. Boundaries softened. Some feared it was dissolution, but Amani said it was communion. Finally, they arrived not at a place, but a convergence. A fold in space where the origin and end of the universe touched. Not in a collision, but a kiss. A place beyond beginning. The Arcora came to a halt, not because it reached a wall, but because it had arrived at the breath before the first word. And there they waited. The origin pulse grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. It pressed against their minds like a tide, not demanding, not speaking, simply existing. Then, Nova stepped forward, not as captain, not as Era reborn, as herself. She opened her arms and whispered a story not in words, but in memory. She shared Earth's pain, its war, its healing. She shared the silence of Thanos' last garden, the laughter of children chasing dreams across rebuilt cities, the stillness of the shrouded, the forgiveness of the ravel, the spark of the twin suns, the breath of the scar of light. She gave it everything, and the pulse answered. It was not language. It was music, not notes, not melodies. The music was made of recognition, of a universe hearing its own story told back to it. The Arcora began to transform, not physically, but existentially. Its walls shimmered into transparency, revealing not the stars outside, but the interior selves of those within. They saw themselves not as they had been, but as they were becoming. The ship shed its material layers like chrysalis. Each crew member became not light, not spirit, but story held in rhythm, memory, and intention. Aman became a song that taught others how to see. Ingrid became a field of gravity, around which new truths could gather. Nova became the thread of narrative that held coherence in chaos. And then nothing. And then everything. Back on Earth, people looked up and gasped. For one long breath, every star in the sky flickered in the same pattern. Not Morse, not binary emotion. The entire planet felt a shared feeling. Something vast and intimate. The sensation of being heard completely. It lasted only a second. But it changed everything. The stars returned to their random glitter. The oceans quieted. Birds resumed their songs. But people knew. They knew. And from that day on, stories became sacred. Not just myths or fiction or history, but every spoken word, every whispered name, every confession, every lullaby. People treated their voices as instruments of balance. Arguments began with acknowledgement. Decisions ended with silence. The world slowed, not in progress, but in pace. Temples were built, not for worship, but for telling. Storytellers became the new philosophers, the new architects, the new leaders. Memory was no longer archived, it was planted, woven, sung. And beneath the tree in the Pacific, now vast and glowing faintly with light from stars unseen, a single blossom bloomed every year. A child from a different land would pick it. They would carry it home. And wherever it was planted, something new would grow: a fruit, a song, a question, a dream. Generations passed. The Akera never returned, but it was never gone. It had become the resonance between words, the shape of compassion, the pause before forgiveness. Some said if you listened closely in the moment just before you fall asleep, you could hear it moving through you, a ship made of memory, carried on a current of stories, still seeking, still listening. And somewhere, in the place beyond beginnings, the origin pulse echoed, not louder, just again. The origin pulse became legend, because it ended, but because it remained. In every corner of the earth and in the distant echoes of Akera's path, it persisted, soft and immeasurable. It was not spoken of often. To name it directly seemed sacrilegious, like trying to cage wind or paint silence. But those who felt it, children staring at the moon, elders watching rivers flow, artists in the midst of creation, or lovers falling asleep with fingers interlaced, they all knew. They knew something vast had happened, something that would never happen again in the same way, but would happen forever in different ways. The earth changed. Without the Akera's continued voyage to trace, humanity turned its gaze inward again, not out of regression, but out of maturity. The impulse to dominate, to explore without permission, had faded. Instead, the new generation, those born in the age of balance, began to cultivate what had long been neglected: the self, the soil, the soul of communities. Cities decentralized, dissolving their rigid centers into ecosystems of culture, spirit, and shared memory. The tallest towers were not for business, but for growing food that sang when touched. Oceans were seeded with sonic gardens, harmonizing with migratory whales that now carried encoded messages across hemispheres. Trees in genetically enriched forests were permitted to speak to one another again through roots and fungal filaments. And when lightning struck, they answered. A council emerged, not political, not tribal, not hierarchical. It was called the Continuum, a fluid body of minds and hearts from all living continents and networks, human and more than human. Its sessions were held in multiple places at once, connected by resonant stones, developed from Amani's spirals. To speak at the Continuum required one to have practiced 3 silences, survived 2 honest regrets, and listened to 7 stories not their own. This was not a law. It was a rhythm. The Continuum did not make declarations. It asked questions. One day, a child asked the Continuum, what happened to the other half? The question came from a boy born in a floating city above the Salish Sea, whose parents had been to among the 3 billion taken by the snap. Though balance had come, and peace with it, the question had not faded. It had simply waited, like a stone under snow, for the right voice to lift it. The Continuum paused for many days. They reviewed all known history, both documented and remembered. They consulted dreamweavers, harmonic archivists, the temple of spiral patterning in Ghana, and the last living elder who had once held the shield of Captain America. But no one could answer with certainty. The other half, those turned to ash in Thanos' act of judgment, had returned in the infinity reversal. Yes, but what about the energy of that loss? The frequency of disappearance itself? Had it simply vanished? Had it lingered somewhere? The continuum issued only this: let the question be carried. And so, the child's question was transformed into a new expedition, not in ships, but in souls. Volunteers trained in memory conduction began traveling Earth and beyond, listening for evidence, not of life or matter, but of narrative residue, what some called soulprint, what others called emotional topology. They learned to interpret shadows on cave walls, not as absence of light, but as presence of grief. They deciphered waves crashing in rhythms never seen before and heard echoes of names long considered mythic. One team discovered a cavern in the Himalayas where sound refused to decay, echoing perfectly preserved cries from the day of the snap. Another uncovered a humming vibration beneath the ruins of Sokovia, where the stones seemed to speak only at twilight. But it was not until they returned to Titan that they found the door. Titan, long thought dead, its air thin and toxic, its soil barren from time and wrath, had been forgotten. But when one archivist, named Kalen, walked its broken surface, carrying a shard of Ingrid's hammer retrieved from the seventh moon by a team of cosmic conservators, something stirred. The sky bent slightly, the light fractured, and then the ground opened. The door was not a structure, it was a shift. It appeared not with blinding revelation, but with gentle invitation, like a memory you're finally ready to revisit. It shimmered, faintly, and when approached, offered no resistance, no sound, no boundary, just a pull inward. Like gravity made of longing, Kaelin entered. What she found defied comprehension, not because it was grand, but because it was true. Inside was neither heaven nor prison. It was a field, endless, twilight-hued, with soft grass that whispered in languages she didn't know. And in that field, walking slowly, were the lost, not ghosts, not illusions, but echoes given shape by remembrance. They walked together, not trapped, not suffering, but suspended in the choice they had never gotten to make. Each shimmered slightly, like light reflecting off a pond. Some looked younger than they had died, others older. Some spoke to one another, others simply knelt, planting flowers that vanished as soon as they bloomed. Kaelin wept. The door, she realized, had been made not by Thanos or any celestial force. It had been built by memory itself, by the pressure of a universe trying to hold onto what it had lost. The field was not an afterlife. It was a holding, a bridge of unresolved resonance. She spent 3 days within, listening. On the fourth, she returned, changed. Her hair had gone silver, her eyes pulsed with echolite, and on her palm was a spiral etched, not by any tool, but by thought. She brought no proof, only presence. When asked what the door meant, she answered, "Forgiveness is not about guilt. It is about what comes after." The continuum declared that the door would be honored, but never exploited. No temples, no pilgrimages, no mythologizing. Only a single garden grown at the site, cared for by volunteers in silence. Open only to those who had lost someone in the snap. It became known as the Middle Field. Stories from the field found their way into art again. A poet from New Mexico wrote a verse that echoed across continents. "We are not the ones who left, we are not the ones who stayed. We are the ones who remembered, and so we carried both." In the Arctic, a chorus of children sang harmonies to whales, who replied in matching frequencies. The ice cracked not with danger, but with release. Elders began to speak again of those first days of the ash, of the silence, of the confusion. And young ones listened not with fear, but with reverence. Grief, once sharp, became a tool. And still, the origin pulse thrummed. Even after so many years, its vibration underpinned all things, like a drumbeat too low for ears but not for blood. People learned to dance to it. Whole cities pulsed in its rhythm. Those born now came into the world humming the same note across continents, untrained, uncoached. Then came the drift. It began subtly. A faint light on the moon's dark side, a series of dreams shared by people who had never met. A pattern of stardust forming the shape of a spiral galaxy in the lungs of a newborn. The continuum convened. They did not panic, they listened. What they found was staggering. The Alcara was returning, not as it had been, not as a vessel, as a constellation, across the sky, in the southern hemisphere. A new pattern appeared, 7 stars that had never been mapped, burning with a light unfamiliar to every speck. They moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the field of Titan Nova, had kept her promise, but she was no longer alone. The Alcora's crew, those who had surrendered form for memory, had become resonance carriers, living threads, moving through the dark, teaching stars to remember themselves. Their return was not a return to place, but a reintegration. Not arrival, but homecoming. They came not with answers, but with stories, and the earth, patient, balanced breathing, was ready to listen. Again, the appearance of the 7 new stars in the southern sky sent ripples through every community, every sanctuary, every corner of the continuum. Their slow, deliberate movement was impossible to ignore. Like a heartbeat waking from deep slumber, pulsing with a cadence both ancient and fresh. Scholars and mystics, artists and scientists, children and elders alike, gathered beneath the heavens to watch as the constellation shifted night by night, shaping itself into patterns, both geometric and organic. Some saw the stars outlined a great tree, others a spiral staircase reaching toward infinity. But all agreed that the pattern was alive. The continuum convened once more, this time not in person, but in a shared meditation that spanned continents and dimensions of thought. Participants attuned their minds to the shifting constellations, seeking to understand the message woven in the light. It was here that Nova's presence was most profoundly felt, not as a person, but as a living thread of memory woven into the fabric of the universe itself. Through the resonance stones, her voice emerged, clear and unembellished. "We are returning," she said simply. "Not as we were, but as we have become." The Alcora no longer travels through space as a vessel, but through the connections between moments, memories, and stories. The constellation is our form now woven into the cosmos, carrying the threads of balance, harmony, and remembrance. We come to complete the cycle we began long ago. A new chapter was unfolding, one that transcended physical boundaries and temporal limitations. Humanity and its allies, the descendants of old alliances and new kinships, alike prepared not for a reunion but for a convergence of consciousness. The realization that the Alcora was no longer a place but a presence prompted the world to reconsider its relationship with the cosmos. Earth was no longer just a planet spinning in isolation, but a note in a universal symphony. And the Alcora was the conductor's baton guiding the melody. Amidst this cosmic revelation, Eli Stark's legacy flourished. His stories, once confined to books and digital archives, now manifested in living art installations and immersive experiences. Cities became storyscapes, where every corner, every building, every park told a fragment of the collective narrative. Visitors could walk through their own memories, confront their fears, or relive the laughter of forgotten moments. Storytellers, descendants of Eli's disciples, trained in the art of memory weaving, taught others to transform their pain into song and their hope into light. Amani spirals evolved beyond their architectural origins, becoming the foundation for a new science, dream engineering. By understanding how dreams could influence reality, researchers developed techniques to harmonize the mental landscapes of entire communities, smoothing the fractures caused by centuries of conflict and loss. The dream engineers worked closely with empathic species from distant worlds, exchanging knowledge and discovering universal patterns that connected all sentient life. Ingrid's hammer, now dispersed across the 7 worlds orbiting the young twin suns, became the access points for interplanetary peace treaties. Representatives from Earth, Wakanda, Lacan, and countless other civilizations gathered at these sacred sites, honoring the promise of balance embodied by the shards. Each shard's vibration resonated with the ethos of its world, creating the network of harmony that protected against aggression and nurtured cooperation. Nova, now a constellation of light, watched over these developments with a gentle, omnipresent grace. She was both everywhere and nowhere, a thread woven through the hearts of the living and the whispers of the stars. Occasionally, she manifested as a shimmering figure of iridescent hues to those in deepest meditation or most profound need, offering guidance not in words, but through the language of memory and emotion. Her presence became a symbol of hope and continuity, reminding all that endings were merely transitions. The middle field on Titan remained a sacred site, a place where those burdened by loss could find solace and connection. Over time, it became a pilgrimage destination not just for humans, but for beings from across galaxies who sought to understand the nature of grief and forgiveness. The field expanded, growing with each visitor's presence, blossoming into a vast landscape of intertwined memories and shared humanity. Seeds from the tree beneath which Arrow had once rested were planted here, growing into towering groves that hummed with ancient song. The continuum itself transformed, embracing a new model of existence that transcended physical assemblies, became a network of shared consciousness, linked by resonant stones and augmented by empathic technologies developed through dream engineering. Members could enter collective states of awareness, sharing insights and emotions instantly across vast distances. This deepened empathy led to the resolution of long-standing conflicts and the prevention of new ones, as misunderstandings were replaced by shared experience. Yet, amid this flourishing harmony, challenges persisted. The universe, in all its complexity, was not without its shadows. There were places where old wounds festered, where civilizations clung to memories of conquest and loss with desperate grip. Dark zones, regions where resonance was disrupted, merged at the edges of explored space. Places where the balance he struggled to hold. The Arctura constellation served as a beacon and a guide, its light illuminating paths through the darkness, but not erasing it. In response, a new cadre of emissaries arose through resonance, drawn from diverse species and backgrounds. These individuals were trained in the arts of memory weaving, emotional resonance, and dream navigation. They journeyed into the dark zones, carrying with them fragments of the Arctura's song, working to restore harmony and guide fractured minds toward peace. Their work was perilous and often solitary, but their resolve was unshakable. One such resonant was a woman named Sora, born on a distant planet where the scars of war had left deep spiritual voids. She carried the fragment of the hammer Ingrid had embedded in the planet's core and wielded it not as a weapon but as a tool of healing. Sora's mission led her into the heart of a dark zone known as the Silent Vela, a place where memory was erased and emotions flattened. There, she faced the shadow of a civilization lost to despair, its people trapped in cycles of forgetfulness. Through patient listening, dream sharing, and the weaving of shared narratives, Sora began to restore flickers of remembrance. She told stories of the Arctura, of Nova's constellation, of the Middle Field's embrace. Slowly, light returned to the Vale, not as conquest, but as invitation. The people began to remember who they were, what they had lost, and what they could become. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the Age of Heroes transformed into the Age of Storytellers. The mantle passed not through might or technology, but through the power of shared experience and collective healing. Eli Stark's descendants founded the Archive of Echoes, a living repository of memories, accessible through immersive technologies and empathic linkages. Visitors could experience historical moments firsthand, learning not through textbooks, but through emotional resonance. Schools taught the art of memory weaving, alongside mathematics and science. Children learned to navigate their own emotional landscapes, cultivating resilience and compassion. The arts flourished, blending technology and nature, science and spirituality, creating expressions that were at once deeply personal and universally accessible. The origins of the snap and the balance were never forgotten, but were no longer sources of fear or division. They became part of a larger narrative about growth, sacrifice, and transformation. Annual festivals celebrated not only survival, but the continual journey toward harmony. These events drew beings from across galaxies, turning Earth into a hub of interstellar cultural exchange. As centuries passed, the memory of Thanos evolved from a figure of destruction to one of paradoxical wisdom, a reminder that choices bear consequences, that balance is fragile, and that redemption is possible even from the deepest shadows. His garden world, long rooted in legend, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking understanding of the complex interplay between power and humility. In the final epochs of this new era, a profound convergence unfolded. The Arcturus constellation, aligned with the twin suns of the young galaxy where Ingrid's hammer shards rested. At this cosmic intersection, resonance waves surged, weaving together stories, dreams, and memories across space and time. The universe itself seemed to pulse with recognition, an awakening of collective consciousness beyond any single form or mind. From this nexus emerged a new phenomenon, the great weaver tapestry of light and sound that connected all sentient beings, bridging past and future, matter and spirit. Through the great weave, stories flowed freely. Memories were shared instantly, and empathy became the fabric binding the cosmos. And in this weave, the essence of every life lost and saved by the snap, every act of courage and kindness, every moment of sorrow and joy, was held sacred. The universe, vast and mysterious, had found balance not as stasis, but as a dance, ever-changing, ever-evolving. And the story, endlessly told and retold, continued. In the epochs that followed the emergence of the Great Weave, existence itself seemed to fold into new dimensions of meaning and connection. The tapestry of light and sound stretched far beyond the physical, embedding itself into the very essence of consciousness across countless worlds. The weave was not merely a conduit for memory or story. It became the lifeblood of the cosmos, a dynamic network through which energy, emotion, and experience flowed freely, transcending space and time. Nova's constellation, once a solitary beacon guiding the Arcturus passage, blossomed into a radiant nexus within the Great Weave. It acted as a fulcrum, a place where stories from across the universe converged, intertwined, and unfolded anew. To many, it was no longer just a pattern of stars but a living presence, an eternal storyteller, breathing with the pulse of infinity. Within this cosmic interplay, the line between self and other blurred. Beings who once defined themselves by physical form or isolated experience now found themselves threads in the grand tapestry, each essential to the whole. Empathy expanded beyond the limitations of biology or culture. It became a universal force, a gravitational field of understanding drawing diverse lives into harmonious orbit. On Earth, the cultural renaissance birthed by the Great Weave deepened beyond imagination. Humanity, joined by countless allied species from other star systems, embraced a new era known as the Era of Resonance. Cities transformed into vast nodes of shared consciousness, their architectures designed not only for shelter, but as instruments of harmonic balance. Living structures breathed and shifted in response to the emotions and stories of their inhabitants, creating environments that nurtured growth, healing, and creativity. At the heart of this renaissance was the Archive of Echoes, now expanded beyond its terrestrial origins to become an interstellar sanctuary of memory. It existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions: physical libraries, virtual realms, and resonant spaces accessible only through deep meditation or empathic connection. Here, visitors could immerse themselves in the lived experiences of others, transcending barriers of language, species, and time. The archive became a crucible for transformation, where wounds were healed by walking through the memories of forgiveness and hope. Amidst these sweeping changes, the legacy of the original Avengers endured in unexpected ways. Their stories, once defined by conflict and sacrifice, had evolved into archetypes of growth, compassion, and balance. They were no longer solitary heroes, but symbols woven into the collective identity of the cosmos. Schools taught their tales as living myths, fluid narratives encouraging students to see themselves as agents of change, stewardship, and harmony. Amani spirals, now known as the spirals of becoming, became the foundation of a universal language of form and intention. They appeared in everything from art to architecture to the dance of galaxies. The spirals were taught as keys to unlocking potential, not only in individuals but within entire civilizations. Through them, learners understood that progress was not linear but cyclical, that endings birthed beginnings, and that every moment contained within it the seeds of transformation. Ingrid's hammer shards, distributed across the twin sun system and beyond, pulsed with newfound power. Their vibrations harmonized with the Great Weave, acting as anchors that stabilized resonant energies and prevented destructive discord. Pilgrims journeyed to these sacred shards, seeking communion with the ancient forces of balance. Rituals performed at these sites blended music, meditation, and storytelling into ceremonies that honored the interconnectedness of all life. Meanwhile, the middle field on Titan expanded into a vast sanctuary known as the Garden of Echoes. Here, the living memories of those lost in the snaphand, in all the tragedies that followed, were preserved not as relics but as vibrant, evolving presences. Visitors experienced these memories through immersive resonance, encountering lost voices that sang with renewed clarity and warmth. The garden became a place of pilgrimage, healing, and reconciliation, drawing seekers from across galaxies who wished to understand the nature of loss and the possibility of transcendence. Within this milieu, the resonance continued their vital work. Sora, the emissary who had healed the Silent Veil, became a revered mentor and guide. She founded the Circle of Resonance, a guild of adept listeners, healers, and dream navigators committed to restoring harmony in the darkest corners of existence. The Circle's members operated at the intersection of science, art, and spirituality, employing advanced empathic technologies alongside ancient practices of storytelling and ritual. Their missions took them to shattered worlds, forgotten dimensions, and the very edges of perception, where they mended fractures in the weave of being. Yet, the cosmos remained a place of contrasts. While the Great Weave unified much, it also illuminated fissures where echoes of old conflicts simmered beneath the surface. Some civilizations resisted the era of resonance, clinging to isolationist or hierarchical paradigms. Others struggled with the overwhelming flood of shared emotion and memory, retreating into self-imposed silence or fragmentation. The balance was not static. It was a dance, demanding constant care, adaptation, and renewal. The continuum, ever vigilant, sought new ways to nurture this delicate equilibrium. They established the constellations of guardians, networks of beings gifted in navigating the complexities of resonance and memory, dedicated to fostering dialogue, understanding, and restoration. These guardians served as mediators and catalysts, weaving threads of reconciliation in places scarred by history and discord. Among the guardians emerged a figure whose presence transcended expectation of being named Kalen. Descended from the first archivist who had discovered the door on Titan, Kalen embodied both profound wisdom and boundless curiosity, their essence shaped by experiences across multiple lifetimes and dimensions. Gifted with the ability to traverse the Great Weave consciously, Kalen acted as a bridge between worlds, facilitating encounters that redefined relationships and expanded horizons. Kalen's journeys led them to the boundaries of existence, two realms where stories had yet to be told, and where the very fabric of reality was still taking shape. Here, they encountered nascent civilizations on the brink of self-awareness, young minds just awakening to the vastness around them. With gentle guidance, Kalen introduced these beings to the principles of resonance and balance, nurturing the seeds of empathy and connection before ignorance or fear could take root. One such encounter occurred in the depths of a star cluster shrouded in nebular mist, where a species of light weavers was evolving. These beings communicated through patterns of bioluminescence and harmonic vibrations, their culture rich with symbolic dance and collective memory. Kalen's presence sparked a renaissance of self-discovery among them, as they learned to harmonize their communal identity with the broader currents of the Great Weave. Back on Earth, the interplay of memory and innovation reached new heights. The archive of echoes developed interfaces, allowing people to live entire lifetimes within shared stories, experiencing the fullness of others' joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures. This immersive empathy transformed education, governance, and interpersonal relationships. Conflicts diminished as individuals and communities learned to understand perspectives deeply, forging bonds that transcended previous divisions. Amid this flourishing, Nova's constellation pulsed brighter than ever, a radiant heart at the center of the weave. Occasionally, she manifested in subtle ways, a shimmer in the corner of vision, a melody woven into the wind, a whisper of memory when least expected. Her presence was a reminder that the journey was ongoing, that balance required eternal vigilance, and that stories once begun were never truly finished. In the great cities and quiet villages alike, new narratives were born, stories that embraced complexity, uncertainty, and the beauty of becoming. Heroes were no longer perfect or infallible. They were seekers, learners, and healers. Villains were not erased, but transformed, their pain acknowledged and woven into the greater tapestry of understanding. The great tale of the snap and its aftermath was told and retold, not as a simple myth, but as a living lesson, a testament to the resilience of life, the power of choice, and the necessity of forgiveness. It was a story with no final ending, for it belonged to all who lived and dreamed and dared to balance light and shadow. And so, the universe danced onward, a great symphony of light and shadow, loss and hope, destruction and creation. The arc, the middle field, the spiral of becoming, the garden of echoes, the resonance, and the continuum all were threads in this eternal weave. The story was infinite, and it was beautiful.